Empire of Blood. Episode 3. The problem must be solved. Heinrich Himmler, Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1945. A production of Empire of Blood. The notice arrives on a Tuesday. It is a single sheet of paper, typed official, bearing the letterhead of the Hamburg Gestapo office. It informs Hedwig Klein that she is to report to the Moorweide assembly point at 6 in the morning, 1 week hence, on the 25th of October, 1941. She is permitted to bring one suitcase weighing no more than 50 kilograms. She is instructed to bring food for several days. She is reminded that valuables, savings, and property remaining in her apartment are hereafter considered the property of the German state. The notice uses the word Umsiedlung, resettlement. There is no explanation of where she is being resettled, or why, or for how long. There is no recourse. There is no telephone number to call with questions. There is no name at the bottom of the letter, only a stamp, a form number, and a date. It is the most administrative thing Hedwig Klein has ever read. It is also, though the language gives no indication of this, a death sentence. Hedwig Klein is 36 years old. She was born in Hamburg in 1905 into a Jewish family that had been part of German civic life for generations. Her father was a businessman. Her mother played piano. She attended the University of Hamburg and distinguished herself in the study of Arabic and Oriental languages, translating medieval texts with a precision that earned her the respect of scholars across Germany. She was, in every conventional measure, a German intellectual, shaped by German universities, working within German academic traditions, contributing to German scholarly life. Then, in the spring of 1933, the year Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, the universities began to change. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic rupture. The change came in stages, in forms, in small bureaucratic adjustments that accumulated into catastrophe with a slowness that made each individual step seem, in isolation, almost manageable. First, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which removed Jewish academics from their university positions. Then, the steady tightening of professional and civic life. Then, immigration, attempted immigration, failed immigration, the quotas from other countries, the fees that could not be paid, the doors that were open 1 year and closed the next. Hedwig Klein did not emigrate. The reasons are not fully known. Perhaps she believed, as many did, that the situation would stabilize, that the worst was already past, that a country that had produced Goethe and Beethoven and Heine could not sustain this particular lunacy indefinitely. Perhaps emigration became impossible before she fully understood that staying was more dangerous than leaving. Perhaps she simply had nowhere that would take her. She remained in Hamburg. She lost her position. She found what work she could. She watched the world she had known contract, rule by rule, law by law, door by door, until by 1941 it had contracted to the dimensions of a single room in a designated Jewish residential building, a yellow star sewn onto her coat, a ration card with a J stamped on it, a city she had lived in her entire life that had become, bureaucratically, legally, systematically, a place where she no longer belonged. And then the notice arrived on a Tuesday. The assembly point at the Moorweide was a gathering place near the Dammtor railway station. On the morning of October 25th, 1941, several hundred Jewish Hamburgers arrived there with their permitted 50 kilograms, having said goodbye to what they were leaving behind, which was everything. They stood in a field while their names were checked against lists. They were processed by officials with clipboards. They were instructed on the order of boarding. The whole thing was conducted with a bureaucratic efficiency that was, in its own way, its own particular horror. The transformation of mass deportation into an administrative event, as orderly as a school enrollment, as impersonal as a tax filing. The train took them east. Hedwig Klein's story ends, as far as the historical record allows us to trace it, somewhere in the occupied territories to which that train was headed. She's listed in Hamburg's deportation records. She does not appear in any post-war survivor registry. Her scholarly work survives in the footnotes of other people's publications. Her name survives in a single letter preserved in a Hamburg archive, written by a colleague who tried and failed to help her find a position abroad. She was murdered, almost certainly at Riga, shortly after arrival. She was 36 years old. Now, the notice that arrived on Hedwig Klein's door did not mention Heinrich Himmler. The assembly point at Moorweide was managed by local officials, following protocols established by officers she had never heard of. The train that took her east was coordinated by a logistics department she could not have named. The camp at Riga was operated by personnel she had never encountered. Every individual step in the process that ended her life was handled by someone following instructions from someone else, all of it moving through layers of administrative distance until it reached the desk of a man in Berlin who held the title Reichsführer-SS Heinrich Himmler. The structure that killed Hedwig Klein was his. Every form she filled out, every stamp on her identity card, every official who checked her name against a list, every train schedule that delivered her eastward was operating within a system he had designed, expanded, and maintained with the focused attention of a man who believed, with absolute sincerity, that what he was building was not a murder machine but a civilization. Remember her name. Hedwig Klein, scholar, translator, daughter of Hamburg. Now let us talk about the man who built the machine that took her. The notice arrives on a Tuesday, but the Tuesday is the end of something that began 8 years earlier. That is the thing about the administrative violence of the Nazi state. It is not a sudden storm. It is a slow drought, the gradual withdrawal of a livable world, conducted so methodically that at each individual step the person experiencing it must ask whether this is really as bad as it feels, whether the next step will really be worse, whether the accumulation will really lead where the logic seems to suggest it must lead. Hedwig Klein would have understood, by October 1941, where the logic led. She had watched it arrive at this destination for 8 years. She had watched colleagues lose positions, then lose the right to work at all. She had watched friends emigrate, and then watched the countries they had emigrated to close their doors. She had watched the Yellow Star become mandatory in September 1941, just weeks before the notice arrived, marking every Jewish person in public with the visual shorthand for "This person is not protected." The Yellow Star is worth pausing on. It is not arbitrary. It is a precise administrative instrument because the system Himmler built requires the public identification of those it targets. The star makes the identification of Jews a civic function, something that any passing German citizen can perform, something that removes the need for specialized knowledge or official action to determine who belongs in which category. Every person who sees a yellow star knows instantly who the wearer is and what their legal status is. The star integrates the identification function into the fabric of ordinary social life. It is a form of distributed surveillance that requires no technology. The Nazi state's approach to surveillance is itself a remarkable bureaucratic achievement. Long before the digital age, the SS and Gestapo built an information system of extraordinary scope. Genealogical records, identity documents, residency registrations, informant networks. the compulsory registration of Jews with local Jewish community organizations that were then made to serve as administrative intermediaries in the deportation process. Every person in Germany existed within this information system in multiple ways simultaneously, and the system could be queried from multiple directions. If you wanted to find the Jews in Hamburg, you did not need to investigate. You consulted the records that the Jews had been required by law to submit to. This is why the deportation process runs as smoothly as it does. The logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of people across a continent, directing them to specific collection points, loading them onto trains, routing the trains to specific destinations. This requires information, and the information infrastructure of the Nazi state is, by 1941, more than adequate to the task. The people who will be killed have, in many cases, provided the system with the information it will use to kill them because they were required by law to do so, and because the law, until the very last moment, presented itself as a framework for managing their lives rather than ending them. The more wide assembly point, where Hedwig Klein reports on the morning of October the 25th, 1941, is a field near a major Hamburg railway station. It is chosen for logistical reasons: proximity to the rail network, sufficient space for several hundred people and their luggage, accessible to the city's Jewish population, manageable by the available police and SS personnel. The people who arrive there have spent the preceding days doing what the notice instructed: packing within the weight limit, settling their affairs, saying goodbye, paying the immigration taxes and administrative fees that the state charges even for deportations that are not emigrations at all. The weight limit on the luggage is 40 to 50 kilograms, depending on the order. This is not accidental. It is calibrated to the symbolic and the practical. Enough to suggest that a journey is being taken, not enough to bring everything. It forces selection, compels leaving things behind, makes the departure feel temporary while ensuring that the person can never return to what they have left. It is, like everything in this system, simultaneously a practical logistical constraint and a psychological instrument. The SS and police at the assembly point have lists. Everything is organized around the lists. The names are called. The people are checked against the rolls. The luggage is labeled. The process has a paper trail that extends backward through the bureaucratic system to offices in Berlin and forward to the receiving installations in the East. Everyone in the chain is following procedure. No one in the chain, except at the very top, has authorized what the chain produces. Hedwig Klein steps into the queue. Her name is called. She is checked against the list. She boards the train. The train goes east. We do not know what she thought on that train. We have no letters from that journey, no account of what she said to the people around her, no record of what the 3 days between Hamburg and Riga looked like from inside the cattle car. We have only the administrative record of her departure and the absolute silence of her non-arrival in any subsequent document. That silence is itself a document. It is the record left by a system that worked as designed. Germany in 1933 is a country that has convinced itself it is a civilization under siege. The conviction is not random. It has been cultivated, carefully and deliberately, over the preceding decade and a half, using the raw material of genuine national trauma and economic catastrophe to construct a political mythology powerful enough to bring an otherwise inconceivable movement to power. To understand how Heinrich Himmler becomes possible, you have to understand what Germany has been through, what it has been told about what it has been through, and what it has been promised in return for accepting a particular story about who is to blame. The First World War ends in November 1918 with Germany's surrender. And the surrender is, for millions of Germans, incomprehensible. The German army had not been defeated in the field. The front lines had not collapsed. No Allied soldier had crossed into German territory in force. The war ended with the German military largely intact and the German homeland untouched by combat. And yet Germany lost, accepted armistice terms that stripped it of territory and imposed crippling financial reparations, and then watched as the Weimar Republic that emerged from the surrender was immediately beset by hyperinflation, political instability, street violence, and the humiliation of a nation that had imagined itself among the greatest powers on earth. The political right, and in particular the nascent Nazi movement, provides an explanation for this that is false in every verifiable fact and psychologically irresistible to people looking for someone to blame. The stab in the back. Germany was not defeated by its enemies from without. It was betrayed by its enemies from within. By Jews, by socialists, by the forces of moral and racial corruption that had weakened the national body from inside. The army held. The will of the German people held. But the parasites had done their work, and the result was the November criminals, the Weimar Republic, the Treaty of Versailles, the systematic humiliation of a great civilization by the forces working against it. This is a lie. But it is told to people who are hungry, who are humiliated, who are watching their savings evaporate in hyperinflation and their dignity shredded by unemployment, and who have been offered no competing story by a Weimar Republic that is too unstable, too divided, too politically exhausted to construct one. Into that vacuum the Nazis pour mythology, and mythology, when it is the only available explanation for unbearable suffering, tends to stick. The Great Depression arrives in 1929 and breaks Weimar's back entirely. Unemployment in Germany reaches 30% by 1932. Banks fail, businesses close. Middle-class families who had survived the hyperinflation of the early 20s now find themselves in poverty. The political system fragments. The communists and the Nazis grow simultaneously. Street violence becomes an ordinary feature of German urban life. And the establishment conservatives who might have contained Hitler decide instead to use him, to make him chancellor in January 1933. Confident that they can manage him. They cannot manage him. Within 18 months, Hitler has dissolved the Reichstag, combined the offices of Chancellor and President after Hindenburg's death, suppressed all political opposition, and begun the legal transformation of Germany from a parliamentary republic into a one-party state answerable to the Führer's will. The speed of this transformation is itself part of its effectiveness. It moves faster than opposition can organize, faster than foreign powers can decide to intervene, faster than the moderate Germans who will later say they did not understand what was happening can formulate an understanding. But here is the thing about the Nazi state that distinguishes it from a simple military dictatorship. It is not just imposed from above. It is, in significant measure, genuinely popular. The economic recovery of the mid-1930s, the rearmament that reduces unemployment, the restoration of national pride through the remilitarization of the Rhineland and the annexation of Austria, the sheer theatrical magnificence of the Nazi public spectacle, the torchlight rallies, the Nuremberg pageants, the constant stream of images of a reborn Germany striding forward. All of this generates real, enthusiastic support from large portions of the German population. And the persecution of the Jews is, for much of this population, either actively supported or passively accepted. And the passive acceptance is enabled by a structure of progressive dehumanization that Himmler, more than any other single figure, architects and refines. The process is incremental. This is critical to understand, because the Holocaust does not begin with death camps. It begins with paperwork. It begins with the law for the restoration of the professional civil service in April 1933, which removes Jews from government employment. It continues with the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which strip Jews of citizenship and forbid marriage between Jews and non-Jews. It accumulates through hundreds of lesser regulations and decrees over the following years: exclusion from certain professions, from public spaces, from schools, from the social fabric of everyday life. The humiliation is progressive, layered. Each new restriction arriving before the last has been fully absorbed, so that the person subject to it is always slightly off balance, always reorienting to a world whose rules have just changed again. For German non-Jews, the same process works differently. Each incremental step seems manageable. The last step was accepted. This step is only slightly further. The person who did not object to the law for the civil service finds it easier not to object to the Nuremberg laws. The person who did not object to the Nuremberg laws finds it easier not to notice the yellow stars. The person who did not notice the yellow stars finds it easier not to ask where the neighbors went. This is the empire that Heinrich Himmler serves and shapes. A state built on a mythology of racial salvation, operated through a bureaucracy of progressive dehumanization, sustained by the genuine enthusiasm of some and the passive acquiescence of many, and moving with a consistency that looks, from inside, like order and progress and national renewal, and from outside, or from the perspective of those it is destroying, like the systematic dismantling of everything that makes a human life livable. The Reichstag fire of February 1933 is the first great escalation. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe is arrested for arson. Whether he acted alone or was helped, or entirely framed, remains historically contested. What is not contested is what happens the morning after. Hitler persuades President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, which suspends civil liberties indefinitely in the name of national emergency. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assembly, the privacy of communications, all suspended. Communist leaders are arrested immediately. The political space for opposition begins to contract. The night of the long knives. In June 1934 is the first time the Nazi state openly murders its own members. Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA Brownshirts who had been Hitler's earliest paramilitary supporters, is killed along with dozens of his associates. Others, including the former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, are also murdered. These are extrajudicial killings carried out in the middle of the night by SS units acting on Hitler's direct order. The response from the German legal establishment, from the judiciary, from the military, from the political class, is silence. More than silence. The army endorses the killings. A member of the German cabinet formally declares them legal after the fact. Read that again. The German cabinet declares extrajudicial political murders legal after the fact. In 1934, the precedent is established. The state can kill its citizens without trial, and the institutions designed to prevent this will not only fail to prevent it, but will actively ratify it. Kristallnacht in November 1938 is the moment when the incremental violence of anti-Jewish policy erupts into public spectacle. Over 2 days, synagogues across Germany and Austria are set on fire. Jewish-owned businesses are destroyed. Jewish homes are invaded. Approximately 91 Jews are killed in the violence directly, and around 30,000 are arrested and sent to concentration camps. The broken glass that gives the event its name, the Night of Broken Glass, covers the sidewalks of German cities. The German public response is mixed. Some approval, some disgust, more than a little discomfort with the crudeness of the violence after years of being told that the anti-Jewish project was being conducted through law rather than mob. Himmler himself, interestingly, disapproves of Kristallnacht, not on moral grounds, but on aesthetic and strategic ones. He sees the chaotic street violence as incompatible with the clean, systematic, bureaucratic approach he has been developing. Mob violence is inefficient. Mob violence leaves evidence that is hard to manage. Mob violence does not scale. What scales is paperwork. What scales is the system. And the man who has been building that system, patiently and methodically, for the better part of a decade, is already one of the most powerful men in Germany. His name, again, Heinrich Himmler. And to understand the system, you have to understand the man, not as a monster, though the word will seem inadequate by the time we are done, but as a person, a product of specific circumstances, specific beliefs, specific failures and compensations that assembled themselves over 4 decades into the architecture of the worst state apparatus of mass murder in modern history. We need to go back to Munich, to a schoolmaster's house, to a boy who was afraid he was ordinary. The political theology of the Nazi state requires more than a passing examination, because it is not simply politics dressed up in religious language. It is a genuine attempt to replace the existing moral and metaphysical framework of German civilization, the Christian framework, the Enlightenment framework, the humanist framework, with a new system of meaning organized around race, blood, and soil. And understanding this attempt, understanding what it offered to the people who accepted it, is essential to understanding how a modern, educated, culturally sophisticated European nation could, within a decade, be operating death camps. The Weimar Republic's failure was not simply economic, though the economic catastrophe of hyperinflation and then depression was real and devastating. It was also a failure of meaning. The Republic offered procedural democracy, elections, parliaments, rights, courts. What it could not offer was a story about who the German people were, where they had come from, where they were going, what their suffering meant, what the future held. The Republic was a set of mechanisms for managing disagreement, not a vision of a destiny. The Nazis offered a destiny. The racial ideology that undergirds the Nazi state is not, as it is sometimes presented in popular history, a thin veneer of pseudo-scientific language over pure thuggery. It is a developed, internally coherent worldview, wrong in every empirical claim it makes, but coherent, that provides answers to the questions that the Weimar Republic could not. Why did Germany lose the war? Because of racial betrayal from within. Why is Germany suffering? Because the parasites are draining it. What is Germany's historical mission? To purify itself and reassert the natural dominance of the Aryan race. Who are the German people? Warriors, farmers, builders, the blood heirs of the ancient Germanic tribes who had held the Roman legions at bay in the Teutoburg forest. This story is false, but it is available, and it is compelling, and it is delivered with the full resources of a modern state's propaganda apparatus in a society that has been primed to receive it by a decade of genuine national humiliation. Himmler is not the author of this story. Hitler is its primary prophet, Goebbels its most skilled communicator, but Himmler is its most systematic institutionalizer. He takes the racial mythology and builds institutions around it. The SS as the racial vanguard, the concentration camp system as the instrument of purification, the genealogical records as the infrastructure of racial classification, the Lebensborn program as the mechanism for producing racially approved children. He translates the mythology into procedure, which is how mythologies become durable. Not when they are believed, but when they are embedded in the practices of daily life and the structures of official administration. The occupied territories that Germany acquires between 1938 and 1941 provide Himmler with an expanded canvas. The annexation of Austria in March 1938 doubles the population under his jurisdiction. The occupation of Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland and then the rest of the country adds more. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 brings millions of Jews under direct Nazi control for the first time. Poland has the largest Jewish population in Europe, approximately 3.5 million people. The invasion of France and the Low Countries in 1940 brings the Jews of Western Europe into the picture. And then the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, opens the vast territories of the East, where the final solution will be most intensively practiced. The evolution of the SS's role in occupied territory is a story of progressive radicalization, each step facilitated by the previous one, each precedent making the next escalation seem like a smaller jump. In Poland, the SS shoots intelligentsia, priests, teachers, and political leaders as part of the effort to destroy Polish national capacity for organized resistance. This is mass murder, but it is mass murder that the Nazi state frames as a security measure. In the Soviet Union, the Einsatzgruppen begin shooting Jews and communist officials immediately following the German advance, initially killing men of military age, and then expanding rapidly to include women, children, the elderly, everyone. By the end of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen have killed an estimated 500,000 people. Himmler receives the reports of these killings on his desk. He reviews them. He requests additional information. He adjusts the deployments of the killing squads. He is, in the administrative language of the institution he runs, managing a program. The bureaucratic language matters enormously here and cannot be emphasized enough. The internal communications of the SS and the Nazi state about the mass killings consistently use a vocabulary of management, logistics, and administration, rather than a vocabulary of violence. People are not killed, they are processed. Populations are not murdered, they are evacuated. The systematic murder of the European Jews is the final solution of the Jewish question, a policy problem being addressed through policy tools. The euphemisms are not simply propaganda for external consumption. They are the internal language of the system, the language in which its participants think about what they are doing. This linguistic management of the horror is one of the most important features of the Nazi genocide, and it is one that Himmler designs with particular care. He is explicit in private communications with his subordinates about the need to maintain the internal vocabulary even among the SS leadership. The Poznan speech, in which he acknowledges directly that the genocide is happening and praises his generals for enduring it, is an explicit exception to the normal practice of euphemism, and he frames it as an acknowledgement among those who already know, a moment of solidarity in a shared secret, not as anything that should be more widely known. The secret, the private acknowledgement surrounded by the public euphemism, is itself a technology of complicity. Everyone in the room is now bound by the shared knowledge. To speak of it outside would be to implicate oneself. The Nazi state governed through this structure of layered knowledge and layered complicity at every level. The German public knew in general terms that something terrible was happening to the Jews. They had watched the deportations. They had watched the empty apartments. They had watched the stopped faces of the people on the trains. They did not necessarily know the specific details of the extermination camps, but they knew enough to have a choice about whether to want to know more, and most of them chose not to want to know more. This chosen ignorance is itself a form of complicity. the complicity of people who have decided that their comfort is worth the price of not fully understanding what their comfort is built on. And Himmler's system is designed to make exactly this chosen ignorance easy to maintain. Heinrich Himmler is born on October the 7th, 1900 in Munich, into a family that is orderly, Catholic, respectable, and thoroughly unexceptional. His father, Gebhard Himmler, is a schoolmaster who had once tutored a Bavarian prince, a connection the family preserves with the careful, slightly anxious pride of the middle class. His mother, Anna, runs the household with a piety and domesticity that the era demanded. Heinrich is the second of 3 sons. He is, by all available evidence, a quiet, studious, unremarkable child. He keeps a diary from an early age. The diary is revealing not so much for what it contains as for what it reveals about the kind of mind keeping it. It is a record of self-discipline, weather noted, tasks completed, books read, exercises performed. It has the quality of a man writing a ledger of himself, keeping accounts of his own behavior as if he suspects he will need to justify it later. There is very little in the early diaries about feeling. There is a great deal about what Himmler does, what he reads, whether he is living up to his own standards. He is not a physically impressive boy. He wears thick glasses from childhood, the kind that make eyes look slightly unfocused and give their wearer an air of peering at the world with effortful precision. He is not an athlete. He is not a natural leader in the playground sense. He is bookish, organized, dutiful. A boy who does very well in school because doing very well in school is the thing expected of him, and Heinrich Himmler is, above all things, a man who does what is expected of him. This compliance is not weakness. It is, in fact, one of the most important things about Himmler, the capacity to subordinate himself completely to an authority he has accepted, to serve with a totality that most people cannot sustain, to find in service not a diminishment of the self, but its fullest expression. He will spend his entire career in service. First to the Catholic Church of his upbringing, which he will eventually abandon. Then to the German nationalist movement of his young adulthood. Finally and completely to Hitler, whose will he will execute with a faithfulness that goes beyond loyalty and approaches something more like devotion. But before all of that, there is the war. The First World War begins when Himmler is 13, and it shapes him the way it shapes his entire generation of German boys, as the context within which manhood is defined. The war is what men do. The war is where Germany's destiny is being decided. And Himmler, growing up in Munich, consuming the newspapers and the patriotic literature and the endless stream of images of soldiers and sacrifice, understands himself to be part of a generation whose moment has come. He does not fight. He trains. He is commissioned as an officer candidate in 1918. But the war ends before he can serve. And this, for the rest of his life, is a wound. Not a wound he will acknowledge directly. Himmler is not a man who acknowledges wounds, but a wound that shapes everything. He missed the war, his generation's defining experience, passed without him. He will spend the next decade compensating for this absence, constructing a martial identity through organizations and uniforms and rituals that are substitutes for the combat experience he never had. He studies agronomy at the Technical University of Munich, a practical choice for a practical man. He considers farming. There is something in Himmler's imagination that is drawn to the soil, to the idea of a peasant people rooted in German earth, to the agrarian mythology that runs through German romantic nationalism. This is not merely an abstract ideology for him. He genuinely experiments with chicken farming as a young man, trying to make the ideology concrete in the dirt and the hen houses of Bavaria. He is not successful at this. He He's not, as it turns out, a farmer. He's a bureaucrat. But the agrarian dream persists in his imagination as a kind of alternative self, the man he might have been in a healthier world. The early 1920s in Munich are a crucible of German nationalist politics, a ferment of organizations and movements and competing visions of what a restored Germany should look like. Himmler is absorbed into this world with a hunger that suggests he has been looking for exactly this kind of belonging. He joins the Nazi Party in 1923 in time to participate in the Beer Hall Putsch, Hitler's failed attempt to launch a coup from a Munich beer hall in November of that year. Himmler is there, carrying the standard of the Reichskriegsflagge, a nationalist veterans organization. The putsch fails. Hitler is arrested. Himmler escapes arrest and processes the experience with his characteristic method. He does not revise his beliefs. He doubles down on them. This is another key feature of Himmler's psychology that is worth marking. He's not a man who learns from evidence that contradicts his worldview. He's a man who absorbs evidence and reinterprets it to confirm the worldview he already holds. The failed putsch does not convince him that the Nazi movement is a lost cause. It convinces him that the movement must be better organized, more disciplined, more strategically sophisticated before it attempts such things again. The conclusion is always, the method needs refinement, not the goal. The goal is fixed. In 1929, Hitler appoints Himmler as Reichsführer of the SS, the Schutzstaffel. At this point, the SS is a small personal bodyguard unit of a few hundred men, subordinate to the much larger SA Brownshirts. It is not an impressive organization, but Himmler takes it and, over the following years, transforms it into something that has no real precedent in modern history. An ideological elite that combines the functions of a political police, a military force, an intelligence agency, a racial classification bureau, and eventually a private economic empire running on slave labor. He begins with selection. The SS man, as Himmler conceives him, is not simply a soldier or a policeman. He is a racial exemplar, a living demonstration of the Aryan ideal that the Nazi movement claims to be restoring. The selection criteria for the SS are elaborate and obsessive. Height requirements, physical measurements, genealogical investigation going back generations to establish racial purity, medical examination. Himmler institutes the Ahnenerbe, ancestral heritage, as a research organization dedicated to establishing the historical and racial credentials of SS membership. He requires SS men to obtain his personal approval before marrying, and their proposed brides are subjected to the same genealogical scrutiny. This is, in microcosm, the project of the entire Nazi state applied to a single organization, the creation of a racially defined community from which the impure have been methodically excluded. But in the SS, it is practiced with an intensity and a specificity that goes beyond anything the broader party apparatus achieves. Himmler is designing a new aristocracy, an order of knights whose legitimacy derives not from birth into noble families, but from proven racial descent and demonstrated ideological commitment. He is obsessed with history in a way that is simultaneously serious and fantastical. He is drawn to medieval German history, to the Teutonic Knights and the Holy Roman Empire, to the idea of a German civilization with deep roots and a grand destiny. He establishes Wewelsburg Castle in Westphalia as a kind of SS spiritual center, a place where the mythology of the order can be given physical form. He commissions research into pre-Christian Germanic religion, into rune symbolism, into the ancient practices of the Aryan ancestors he is certain once dominated the world. He is, in this aspect of his character, something genuinely strange. A man who can manage the logistics of the most bureaucratically sophisticated murder operation in history, while simultaneously believing that the SS is the reincarnation of a Teutonic order of racial paladins. This duality, the meticulous administrator and the mystical crank, is not a contradiction in Himmler's own mind. He believes both things simultaneously and sees them as complementary. The mystical dimension provides the justification and the meaning. The administrative dimension provides the mechanism. The SS is doing something historically necessary and cosmically significant, and the careful maintenance of genealogical records and the precise management of deportation logistics are both expressions of the same transcendent project. He expands the SS's power through the 1930s with a patient, systematic aggression that the other Nazi leaders consistently underestimate. He absorbs the political police of the individual German states into a unified organization he controls. He creates the security service, the SD, as an intelligence apparatus. In 1934, with the Night of the Long Knives, he coordinates the killing of the SA leadership, using the event to permanently subordinate the brown shirts to the SS and to cement his position as the second most powerful man in Germany. In 1936, he is appointed chief of the German police, giving him control over all law enforcement in the Reich. By 1936, Himmler controls the SS, the racial and ideological elite, the Gestapo, the secret state police, the SD, the intelligence service, the Kripo, the criminal police, the entire concentration camp system. No single individual in any modern state had previously held such concentrated authority over the instruments of internal coercion. He is not, in formal terms, the number 2 man in the Nazi hierarchy. Goering, Goebbels, and others outrank him in party terms. But in terms of practical power over who can be arrested, who can be surveilled, who can be imprisoned, who can be killed within Germany's borders, he is unrivaled. And the thing that is most disturbing about this accumulation of power is how he uses it. He uses it carefully. He uses it with system. He uses it the way a man who has been keeping a ledger of his own behavior since childhood uses it. With documentation, with process, with the bureaucratic instinct that every action should have a file and every file should be in order. The Holocaust that Himmler architects is not, contrary to some early historiographical framings, a chaotic outburst of primitive violence. It is organized, it has a paper trail, it has internal audits and efficiency reviews, it has an administrative vocabulary designed to obscure its nature. Sonderbehandlung for killing, Umsiedlung for deportation, Endlösung for murder at continental scale. But the administrative vocabulary serves the violence rather than replacing it. Beneath the euphemisms, the record is precise. We know this because historians have been reading the records for 80 years. Himmler believed he was making history. He believed he was the instrument through which a racial catastrophe of civilizational dimensions was being averted, that the Jewish people posed a genuine existential threat to the German nation and the Aryan race, and that the elimination of this threat was not a crime, but a service. A terrible, historically necessary service that required men of iron will and cold discipline to perform. He said as much explicitly in his most famous speech, delivered to SS generals at Poznan in October 1943. The speech is extraordinary. He tells his audience that they know what it is to see 100 corpses lying together, or 500, or 1,000. To have gone through this and at the same time, apart from exceptions caused by human weakness, to have remained decent people. That is what has made us hard. This page of glory in our history has never been written, and is never to be written. He is telling his generals that they are better human beings for having committed mass murder, that the capacity to kill without flinching is the highest expression of moral strength, that history will not record what they have done, but that history's silence is itself a tribute to their discipline. He was partially wrong about the silence. The records survived, the witnesses survived, the testimony survived, but he was not wrong about how he understood what he was doing. He genuinely believed it, and the genuine belief is, in some ways, the most frightening thing about him. A hypocrite knows he is lying. He can be reached by his own conscience, can be shamed, can be confronted with the gap between his stated values and his actual behavior. Himmler has no such gap to exploit. His stated values and his actual behavior are aligned. He believes the violence is justified. He believes the system is necessary. He believes that what he is doing is, in the deepest possible sense, right. And in Hamburg in 1941, a woman named Hedwig Klein receives a notice on a Tuesday and begins to pack a suitcase. One detail about the early Himmler diaries that historians sometimes overlook: the entries almost never record surprise. The weather changes, the tasks change, the people he encounters change, but the emotional register of the diary is flat, disciplined even, as if he has decided that being surprised by things is a kind of weakness. He will not be surprised. He will note, process, and continue. This quality of emotional non-reactivity, of meeting the world without being visibly marked by it, is not the absence of feeling. It is the containment of feeling. It is a man who has learned very early that feeling is something to be managed rather than expressed, something that belongs in a different compartment from the compartment where the important work gets done. This emotional management will serve him in the terrible years ahead, in the way that no other quality could. Managing the genocide requires a man who will not break under the weight of what he is managing, who will read the reports, process the numbers, direct the resources, and close the file, who will meet his subordinates' eyes at the Poznan dinner table, after the speech, and raise a glass, who will eventually, in the final weeks of the Reich, try to negotiate a political future for himself as calmly as if the previous 12 years had been merely a professional assignment he was now looking to move on from. Himmler manages his feelings about the genocide the way he managed his feelings about everything else. He does not have them, or rather, he has them, and he puts them somewhere they cannot interfere with the work. The work is too important for interference. The diaries that Himmler keeps as a young man reveal something important about the texture of his inner life that the grand narrative of his career sometimes obscures. He is lonely. Not operationally lonely. He is surrounded by people throughout his adult life, but constitutionally lonely, in the way of a person who finds genuine emotional connection difficult and has largely stopped trying for it. His early diaries record his social interactions with the dutiful neutrality of a man filling out a form. He notes who he spoke to. He notes the occasion. He does not record what the conversation felt like, whether he was moved or amused or bored, whether any particular person seems to him interesting or worth knowing better. People in the early Himmler diaries are entries, not relationships. He has affairs, one long-term relationship with his future wife, Margaret Boden, whom he marries in 1928, and later a relationship with his personal secretary, Hedwig Potast, with whom he has 2 children. But the accounts of his marital life suggest the same quality that characterizes his other personal relationships, a fundamental emotional unavailability, a man who goes through the forms of intimacy without achieving its substance. Margaret Himmler, in the post-war testimonies available about her, emerges as a woman who understood very little of what her husband was actually doing and who had accommodated herself to his absence, physical and emotional, without apparently knowing what the absence was occupied by. His relationship with Adolf Hitler is the great exception to this pattern of emotional distance. For Hitler, Himmler has something that looks, from the outside, like love. Not romantic love, obviously, but the kind of total devotion that certain subordinate personalities feel toward the authority figure they have decided to serve absolutely. He calls Hitler the greatest man in world history. He carries out Hitler's will with a completeness that his other SS officers sometimes find excessive. He is, in the language of organizational psychology, the ultimate loyalist, a man who has subordinated his own judgment entirely to the judgment of the leader he has chosen to follow. This is not weakness, exactly. It is a specific kind of strength, the strength of a man who has resolved the uncertainty of independent moral judgment by outsourcing it. Once you have decided that the leader is right, and that serving the leader is the highest expression of your own value, you are freed from the burden of asking whether any particular order is just. The order is just because the leader gave it. The leader is right because you have decided he is right. The circularity is load-bearing. Himmler's ideology of racial mysticism provides the transcendent framework within which this devotion makes sense. Hitler is not just a political leader. He is the historical instrument through which the German Volk will be reborn. Service to Hitler is therefore service to something larger than Hitler, to the racial destiny that Hitler represents. This structure of meaning, the leader as the embodiment of a cosmic historical force, is not unique to Nazism. It appears in many authoritarian movements and many religious traditions. What is distinctive in Himmler's case is the administrative thoroughness with which he attempts to institutionalize it. The rituals and symbolism of the SS are Himmler's work, and they are designed to create exactly the kind of total identification between the individual SS man and the institution that Himmler himself feels toward Hitler. The death's head insignia, the runic symbols, the carefully designed uniforms, the initiation ceremonies, the requirement to marry within the racial guidelines he sets, the Wewelsburg Castle with its round table modeled on the Arthurian legend. All of this is institutional mythology building, the deliberate construction of a sense of membership in something that transcends ordinary civic life, something ancient and significant and demanding. The SS man is not a policeman or a soldier in the ordinary sense. He is a racial knight, a guardian of civilization's future, a member of an order whose significance will only be fully understood by generations yet unborn. This mythology works. It works because it fills a genuine psychological need, the need for significance, for belonging to something larger than the individual self. And it works because it is backed by the very real power of one of the most formidable state apparatuses in European history. You are not just symbolically a member of an elite. You have a badge and a gun and an institutional structure that can arrest, imprison, and kill. The mythology and the practical power reinforce each other. The mystical significance makes the practical power feel justified, and the practical power makes the mystical significance feel real. His reading habits are revealing. Himmler is a voracious but oddly selective reader. He is drawn to histories of the ancient Germanic tribes, to accounts of medieval German knights and holy orders, to the pseudo-historical texts of the German nationalist tradition that construct an imaginary Aryan past of noble warriors defending European civilization against Eastern barbarism. He is drawn to books on agriculture and rural life, to the idealization of the German peasant as the bedrock of racial health. He reads, with evident enthusiasm, texts of racial pseudoscience, the phrenology and eugenics and racial classification literature that provides the academic scaffolding for Nazi ideology. He is also drawn to the occult, to Atlantis mythology, to the theories of various fringe thinkers who locate the origins of Aryan civilization in lost continents and prehistory. He funds the SS Ahnenerbe, Ancestral Heritage, research organization to investigate these theories scientifically, which is to say, to dress them in scientific language regardless of what the actual evidence shows. He sends expeditions to Tibet. He has researchers investigating the history of Germanic runes. He is convinced that somewhere in the deep past is evidence of an Aryan Ur civilization from which the German people are descended and to which they can return. This is not, in the conventional sense, scientific thinking, but it is not random irrationalism either. It is a particular kind of motivated reasoning, the intellectual project of a man who starts from a conclusion, the racial superiority of the Aryan people, and searches the historical and anthropological record for evidence that confirms it. Each piece of confirming evidence strengthens the conviction. Each piece of disconfirming evidence is either ignored or reinterpreted. The worldview is sealed against contradiction. His agricultural ambitions, the chicken farming of his youth, the continued idealization of the German peasant throughout his career, are connected to this racial mythology in ways that illuminate the texture of his thinking. The peasant, in the Nazi racial worldview, is the purest expression of the Aryan people, rooted in the German earth, not corrupted by the cosmopolitan abstraction of city life, not infected by the Jewish intellectualism that the Nazis associate with urban modernity. Himmler's personal fantasy of farming, never realized, always present, is a fantasy of return to this imagined purity, a personal enactment of the broader racial project. He is, in this aspect of his character, something genuinely Germanic in a way that most of his colleagues are not. He believes, at a level that seems to be more than rhetorical, in the blood and soil mythology that the Nazi movement deploys primarily as propaganda. For Himmler, it is not propaganda, it is conviction. And the conviction, combined with the administrative apparatus he builds to give it institutional form, is what makes him uniquely dangerous. Because a man who genuinely believes he is serving a cosmic historical necessity will not be stopped by the ordinary checks on human behavior. He will not be stopped by compassion, because compassion is a weakness that the racial knight must overcome. He will not be stopped by law, because the law is an instrument of the racial state and serves the racial project. He will not be stopped by the evidence of suffering, because the suffering is the cost of a historically necessary process. He will not be stopped by his own doubt, because doubt has been resolved by the unshakable conviction that the leader is right and the project is necessary. He will stop when someone stops him. And in the case of Heinrich Himmler, that will take 12 years and 50 million deaths. The concentration camp system begins before most people think it begins. Not in 1942, not with the Wannsee Conference and the administrative formalization of the final solution. It begins in March 1933, 6 weeks after Hitler becomes Chancellor, when the SS opens the first camp at Dachau, 12 miles northwest of Munich. Dachau is initially a camp for political prisoners. Communists, social democrats, trade unionists, anyone the new regime considers an enemy. The first prisoners arrive from the surrounding area, hauled in by police and SS units operating under the emergency powers of the Reichstag fire decree. Himmler personally oversees the establishment of Dachau. He is proud of it. He presents it to the Munich press as a model facility, a place where enemies of the state will be reformed through work and discipline. The language is rehabilitation. The reality is something else. A controlled environment for the physical and psychological destruction of political resistance, staffed by SS guards operating under a system of regulations and punishments that Himmler has personally designed. The SS guard system at Dachau becomes the template for every subsequent camp. Theodor Eicke, whom Himmler appoints as Dachau's commandant in 1933, develops a set of camp regulations that will be adapted and applied in every concentration camp the SS operates. The regulations govern everything: the schedule of the day, the structure of punishment, the hierarchy of authority, the precise conditions under which a guard may shoot a prisoner. They are meticulous, they are systematic. They are designed to produce, in the guards who follow them, a particular relationship to violence. Not the spontaneous cruelty of a mob, but the controlled, authorized, procedurally correct application of force within a defined institutional framework. This is the crucial innovation. The SS does not rely on hatred to produce violence, though hatred is present and cultivated. It relies on procedure. The guard who beats a prisoner is not acting on individual rage. He is applying punishment number 2 from the camp regulations. The guard who shoots a prisoner in the act of attempting to escape, which is often fabricated, is not acting on personal impulse. He is following the rules. The violence is institutional. It is processed through a system that removes individual moral agency and replaces it with role compliance. This is how ordinary human beings become the staff of death camps. They do not arrive as monsters, they arrive as men, mostly young, mostly unremarkable, products of the same Germany that produced Hedwig Klein and millions of others. They arrive with whatever prejudices their upbringing has given them, and in Nazi Germany, those prejudices have been carefully cultivated and officially sanctioned. But the transformation from a person with prejudices to a person who can systematically dehumanize and kill is not simply a matter of pre-existing hatred. It is a matter of institutional context, of the gradual normalization of behavior that would be unthinkable outside the institution, of the daily reinforcement of a moral universe in which the people in the prisoner uniforms are not fully human. Himmler understands this. He designs the SS accordingly. The racial classification system that the SS operates is one of the most elaborate bureaucratic projects in modern history. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 define Jewishness in terms of grandparental ancestry, creating 4 categories: full Jews, those with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents; Mischlinge of the first degree, those with 2 Jewish grandparents; Mischlinge of the second degree, those with 1 Jewish grandparent; and Aryans, those with no Jewish grandparents. The classification determines not just citizenship, but every other aspect of civic and social life. Who can marry whom can work where, whose children can attend which schools. The SS Race and Settlement main office maintains genealogical records and processes applications for classification. It issues rulings, it adjudicates appeals. It processes the paperwork through which German society is being sorted into categories of the protected and the condemned. The scale of this operation, maintaining records on millions of people, processing millions of documents, sustaining the administrative fiction that this is an orderly legal process rather than a preparation for murder, requires enormous institutional resources. It requires clerks and filing systems and forms and procedures. It requires, in short, a bureaucracy. And bureaucracies, as Hannah Arendt observed with specific reference to this one, produce a particular kind of participant, people who do their jobs, who process their section of the paperwork without necessarily having a clear view of where it leads, who follow the procedures correctly, who arrive on time and fill out the forms completely and go home at the end of the day. The clerk who stamps the deportation order is not, in her own experience, condemning anyone to death. She's processing a form. The form goes somewhere else. What happens somewhere else is someone else's responsibility. This diffusion of responsibility across a large bureaucracy is not an accident. It is a design feature. Himmler's apparatus is specifically engineered so that no single person below the level of the top command has a clear view of the whole. Each person's responsibility is bounded by their role. Each role is defined by procedure. The procedure produces outcomes that each individual participant can decline to fully understand. The deportation process illustrates this perfectly. In Hamburg in 1941, when Hedwig Klein receives her notice, the process that generated that notice has passed through at least a dozen organizational hands. The Reich Main Security Office in Berlin, which Reinhard Heydrich heads under Himmler's authority, issues the orders for deportations. The orders pass to the regional Gestapo offices, which maintain the lists of Jews in their areas. The Gestapo office prepares the individual notices. The notices are delivered by ordinary mail, by the postman who delivers everything else on the street. The notices instruct people to report to assembly points administered by the city authorities, in many cases by the Jewish community organizations themselves, which are coerced into cooperating with their own destruction under threat of worse consequences if they refuse. The assembly points are managed by local police. The trains are scheduled by the Reichsbahn, the German National Railway, which treats deportation trains as ordinary freight transactions. The train crews are not SS men. They are railway workers. They pick up cargo at one station and deliver it at another. The cargo happens to be human beings. The delivery point happens to be a site where those human beings will be murdered. No single person in this chain, except at the very top, has authorized the killing. And yet the killing happens with a regularity and a volume and an efficiency that has no precedent in human history. The Wannsee Conference of January 20th, 1942, is often presented as the moment when the Holocaust was decided. This is not quite accurate. The mass killings had already begun in the East, where the Einsatzgruppen, mobile SS killing squads, had been murdering Jews in enormous numbers following the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. By the time of the Wannsee meeting, approximately 500,000 Jews had already been killed in the occupied Soviet territories. What Wannsee does is coordinate. It is a meeting of 15 senior Nazi officials, chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, at which the administrative machinery for killing the remaining 11 million Jews of Europe is agreed upon and assigned to relevant agencies. The meeting lasts approximately 90 minutes. The attendees include representatives of the Foreign Ministry, the Justice Ministry, various Reich administrative offices, and the SS. They discuss logistics. They discuss numbers. They discuss which categories of Mischlinge will be included or excluded. They discuss the capacity of existing facilities and the need for expansion. The minutes of the Wannsee Conference, the Wannsee Protocol, were discovered by historians after the war. They are one of the most extraordinary documents in the archive of the 20th century. They describe mass murder in the language of administration. The language throughout is euphemistic, but the meaning, to anyone who understands the context, is completely clear. When Heydrich uses the phrase Evakuierung nach dem Osten, evacuation to the east, he means deportation to extermination. When he discusses Sonderbehandlung, special treatment, he means killing. The euphemisms are not confusion. They are protocol. They are the official language of the system. Himmler is not at Wannsee. He does not need to be. Wannsee is an implementation meeting. The decision has already been made at the level of Hitler and Himmler months earlier. What Wannsee does is distribute the responsibility, bring the relevant ministries into the process, create the administrative architecture for the genocide at continental scale. The extermination camps are built beginning in late 1941 and accelerating through 1942. They are distinct from the concentration camps that had been operating since 1933. The concentration camps are for imprisonment and forced labor. The extermination camps, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, and the largest of all, Auschwitz-Birkenau, are for killing. Their primary purpose is not to detain, but to murder, as efficiently as possible, as many people as the transportation system can deliver. Auschwitz-Birkenau, where Hedwig Klein was almost certainly sent, becomes the largest killing facility in human history. At its peak in 1944, during the deportation of Hungarian Jews, it receives and kills approximately 10,000 people per day. 10,000 people per day. The gas chambers operate around the clock. The crematoria work continuously. The Sonderkommando, Jewish prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria under threat of death, carry the bodies, extract the gold from the teeth, burn the dead. The entire operation, the arrival of the trains, the selection on the platform, the separation of those deemed fit for labor from those to be killed immediately, the processing of the latter into the undressing rooms, the operation of the gas chambers, the extraction and burning of the bodies, the collection and cataloguing of the belongings, runs like a factory. It has a shift schedule. It has production targets. It has administrative records. It generates reports that flow upward through the SS hierarchy to Himmler's desk. Himmler visits Auschwitz twice. He inspects the facilities, watches the process, reviews the numbers. He expresses satisfaction with the operation's efficiency. He suggests improvements. He is, in these visits, the quality control inspector of an industrial death operation, and his response to what he observes is the response of a manager reviewing a process. What is working? What can be improved? What are the production bottlenecks? There is a moment in 1941 before the extermination camps are built, when Himmler witnesses a mass shooting by an Einsatzgruppe in Minsk. He is visibly disturbed by the experience, not by the moral horror of what he is watching, but by the psychological cost to the shooters. He is concerned about the mental health of his men. The shooting method, he concludes, is too direct, too personal, too psychologically taxing for the people required to perform it at scale. This is one of the reasons the extermination camps are developed with gas chambers rather than continuing to rely on mass shooting. The technology creates more distance between the killer and the killed. And distance is, as we have seen in every context we have discussed in this episode, a structural requirement for sustained atrocity. The gas chambers resolve what Himmler considers the human resources problem of mass murder. By making the killing mechanical, by inserting a locked door and a ventilation system between the SS guard and the dying, the psychological burden is distributed and reduced. The guard who locks the door and releases the gas does not see the face of the person who dies. He follows a procedure. He reports completion. He goes to the next task. Kurt Gerstein is an SS officer who witnesses gassings at Belzec and Treblinka in August 1942. He is there ostensibly to assess the delivery of Zyklon B for use in the gas chambers. He is a complicated figure, a committed Christian who had earlier been imprisoned by the Gestapo for anti-Nazi activities, who somehow managed to join the SS, who had obtained his position, he later said, in order to witness and expose what was happening. He watches men, women, and children die in the gas chambers at Belzec. He watches the Sonderkommando extract the bodies afterward. He counts the shoes, the documents, the personal items left behind. He attempts to report what he has seen to a Swedish diplomat on a train. He attempts to report it to the papal nuncio in Berlin. He contacts members of the anti-Nazi resistance. His reports reach Allied governments. They are largely disbelieved or dismissed as exaggeration. He is in the extraordinary and terrible position of a man who has witnessed something so extreme that the people he tells it to cannot integrate it into their understanding of what is possible. After the war, Gerstein turns himself into French authorities and writes a detailed account of what he witnessed. He is held in Cherche Midi prison in Paris, where he dies in July 1945 under disputed circumstances. His testimony, which was initially received with skepticism, becomes one of the key pieces of eyewitness evidence at the Nuremberg trials. He saw it. He tried to tell people. The system kept running. The machinery had been built too well to be stopped by witnesses. The role of ordinary German institutions in the Holocaust is a subject that remains uncomfortable and under-examined even decades after the war. The Reichsbahn has been discussed. The medical profession has been discussed. But consider also the legal profession. German lawyers and judges and courts continued to function throughout the Nazi period, applying a body of law that had been progressively corrupted by racial legislation, issuing rulings that gave legal form to persecution, participating in a justice system that was, by 1942, fully integrated into the machinery of the final solution. The Nuremberg laws were laws. They were enforced by courts. They were interpreted by judges. German legal professionals who continued to practice under these conditions were not, by their own self-understanding, complicit in atrocity. They were practicing law. The law happened to be doing terrible things. Consider the insurance industry. Jewish property confiscated under the prescription of Nazi racial law was, in many cases, insured. The insurance companies processed the claims, or declined the claims, using the ordinary procedures of commercial insurance adjudication. The fact that the property had been stolen by the state rather than lost in a fire did not, from the perspective of the insurance contract, necessarily change the contractual question. The industry participated in the spoliation of Jewish property as a business transaction. Consider the civil engineering firms that built the crematoria at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The firms submitted competitive bids. They designed the facilities to specification. They supervised construction. They invoiced for completed work. The work they had completed was a building designed to burn the bodies of murdered people at industrial scale, and the firms that built it processed this fact through the same institutional filters that every institution uses to avoid confronting what its work produces. This is a specialized facility for the disposal of remains. The question of how the remains came to require disposal is not our department. This is the diffusion of complicity that Himmler's system achieves. Not one institution explicitly involved in murder. Many institutions, each performing one function that contributes invisibly from within to murder at scale. The logistics of genocide are not taught in schools. They should be. Not because logistical knowledge makes genocide easier. It does not, and this is not the lesson. But because the logistical reality of the Holocaust reveals something essential about how mass murder at this scale is possible at all. It is possible because it was organized. It was organized because someone, many someones, applied their professional skills, their institutional knowledge, and their administrative competence to the problem of how to kill millions of people efficiently. The Holocaust is, among other things, a case study in project management, and the people who managed it were not especially remarkable people. They were competent, organized professionals doing their jobs. The railway system is the most important component that is least often discussed. The Reichsbahn, the German national railway, is the logistical backbone of the final solution. Without railways, mass deportation at the scale the SS requires is impossible. The distances involved, from Hamburg to Riga, from Amsterdam to Auschwitz, from Salonika to Treblinka, can only be covered with the speed and volume that genocide demands if a railway network exists and cooperates. The Reichsbahn cooperates fully. The cooperation of the Reichsbahn is not forced, it is negotiated. The SS pays the standard passenger fare, a reduced group rate since they are moving large numbers of people, for each deportee transported. The Reichsbahn accepts the fares, assigns the train slots, provides the rolling stock, schedules the routes, employs the drivers and conductors and dispatchers who execute the journeys. The Reichsbahn does not ask what happens when the trains arrive. It books the transportation transactions, processes the payment, and moves on to the next booking. This is the economic structure of complicity. The Reichsbahn is not in the death business, it is in the transportation business. The fact that its transportation services are being purchased by an organization in the death business is a matter of, in the institutional language of the time, the purchaser's business. The Reichsbahn provides services without discrimination to all who can pay the fare. It is, in its own internal accounting, perfectly neutral. Adolf Eichmann, the SS officer who manages the logistics of the deportation system under Himmler's command, is the figure most associated with the railway coordination. Eichmann's genius, if it can be called that without grotesque irony, is the genius of scheduling, managing the competing demands of multiple deportation streams, military priorities for railway capacity, production requirements at the extermination camps, and the complex politics of occupied and allied territories from which Jews are being deported, into a system that functions with something approaching industrial efficiency. Eichmann is the figure Hannah Arendt writes about in Eichmann in Jerusalem, and his trial, conducted in Israel in 1961 after Mossad agents tracked him to Argentina and abducted him, produces the most extensive public examination of how the deportation bureaucracy worked that history had yet seen. Eichmann's defense, which Arendt engages with extensively, is essentially that he was an administrator, that he managed the logistics of transportation rather than the reality of killing, that he followed orders within his institutional role and did not make the moral determinations that the orders represented. This defense is false in important ways that Arendt identifies. Eichmann was not a mindless cog. He showed initiative, took pride in his work, identified with the project he was serving. But it is not entirely false either, and Arendt's discomfort with its partial truth is what produces the concept of the banality of evil. The recognition that the Holocaust's perpetrators included a large number of people who were, in their ordinary human dimensions, genuinely ordinary, and that the system was designed so that such ordinary people could participate without ever having to make the kind of explicit moral choice that most of us imagine we would make differently. Himmler designs that system. He is the architect of the ordinary. The Eichmanns work within the structure he builds. The concentration camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau deserves attention that goes beyond the death toll, because the physical and organizational reality of the camp reveals something about Himmler's vision that the statistics alone cannot convey. Auschwitz is not simply an extermination facility. It is a complex of approximately 40 sub-camps and facilities spread across an area of dozens of square kilometers. It includes Auschwitz I, the original camp, built to house Polish political prisoners and still operating throughout the war. It includes Auschwitz-II-Birkenau, the mass extermination facility built beginning in 1941 where the gas chambers and crematoria are located. It includes Auschwitz III-Monowitz, a slave labor camp built adjacent to the IG Farben synthetic rubber plant, where prisoners are worked to death in industrial production. This combination, mass extermination and industrial slave labor coexisting at the same physical site, reveals the peculiar double nature of the Nazi concentration camp system under Himmler's management. The camps serve two purposes that are sometimes in tension. They kill people and they work people. The selection on the Auschwitz arrival platform, the infamous selection conducted by SS physicians, is the moment where this tension is resolved. Those deemed fit for work are directed to the labor camp. Those deemed unfit, which means the elderly, the very young, those who appear ill or weak, are directed to the gas chambers. The SS physicians who conduct the selections are medical doctors. They have taken the Hippocratic Oath. They stand on the platform and assess arriving prisoners, and with a gesture, left, right, direct them toward labor or toward death. Josef Mengele, the most notorious of the Auschwitz physicians, conducts selections with a cheerfulness that survivors consistently describe as more disturbing than cruelty would have been. He whistles while he works. He directs people with an air of pleasant efficiency. He conducts his medical experiments on twins and others with the manner of a researcher engaged in interesting scientific work. Mengele is an extreme example, but not an isolated one. Across the camp system, medical and scientific personnel participate in the violence as professionals, exercising their professional skills. Doctors certify deaths that were murders. Pharmacists supply the Zyklon B. Engineers design the gas chambers and crematoria for maximum efficiency. The professional class of the Nazi state, the people with the most education and the most developed intellectual tools for evaluating what is happening, participates as enthusiastically as the guards and the administrators. This participation is not incidental. Himmler specifically cultivates the involvement of educated professionals in the SS, specifically because he wants the racial project to have the imprimatur of scientific and professional legitimacy. The SS Race and Settlement main office is staffed partly by people with advanced degrees in biology, anthropology, and medicine. The research programs of the Ahnenerbe are conducted by credentialed academics. The medicalization of the killing, the presence of physicians at the selections, the framing of extermination as a public health measure against racial disease, is a deliberate design feature. Inside the camps, the resistance that emerges is real and significant and often overlooked in narratives that emphasize the passivity of the victims. There are documented uprisings at Treblinka in August 1943, at Sobibor in October 1943, at Auschwitz-Birkenau in October 1944. These uprisings are conducted by people who know they are going to die, who have nothing to lose, and who choose to die fighting rather than to die passively. They succeed in the sense that they kill SS guards and disrupt the operations of the camps, and they fail in the sense that they are suppressed and the survivors are killed. The Sonderkommando revolt at Auschwitz-Birkenau in October 1944 is among the most extraordinary acts of resistance in the entire history of the Holocaust. The Sonderkommando are the Jewish prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria, carrying the bodies, extracting the gold from teeth, burning the dead. They live with the direct knowledge of the killing operation in a way that even most camp prisoners do not. They are scheduled for periodic liquidation, replaced with new Sonderkommando, so that no one lives long enough to give full testimony to what they have witnessed. In October 1944, knowing they are scheduled to be killed, they revolt. They use explosives smuggled into the camp by Jewish women workers from a nearby munitions factory. Rosa Robota and her colleagues, who are later captured and executed. They destroy one of the crematoria. They kill several SS guards. They attempt to break out. They are suppressed. Most of them die in the uprising or in the executions that follow. Rosa Robota's last words, before her execution, are reportedly a phrase meaning, "Be strong and be brave." Remember that name too. Rosa Robota. She was a fighter. She was 23 years old. The system that Himmler built was designed to prevent exactly this kind of resistance. Through isolation, through starvation and exhaustion, through the destruction of social bonds, through the cultivation of uncertainty about what was happening and what the future held. That people resisted anyway, that they organized, that they smuggled explosives and planned uprisings and kept diaries and drew maps and sent out letters. This resistance is part of the story of the Holocaust that the perpetrators' administrative records do not contain. It is the story told by the people who were supposed to be silent. Hedwig Klein arrives in Riga in late October 1941. She arrives with approximately 1,000 other Jewish hamburgers on a train that has taken 3 days to travel what in normal circumstances is a journey of a day and a half. The conditions on the train are what they are on all the deportation trains. Crowded, cold, without adequate food or water, without the basic provisions of a tolerable journey. People are ill when they arrive. People have died on the way. At Riga, the Hamburg transport is met by SS and police units. There is an immediate selection, though not the systematic Auschwitz platform selection that will be formalized later. The transport is directed toward the Rumbula forest. In the Rumbula forest, outside Riga, 2 mass shootings are conducted in November and December 1941. Approximately 25,000 people are killed. The shootings are carried out by Einsatzgruppen units and local Latvian auxiliary police under SS command. The victims are marched to pits that have been dug in advance by forced laborers. They are ordered to remove their outer clothing. They are shot. The bodies fall into the pits. Hedwig Klein is almost certainly among those killed in these shootings, or in the period immediately following the Hamburg transport's arrival. She does not appear in subsequent records. She is not among the survivors of the Riga ghetto who give testimony after the war. She is not in the list of those who survived Stutthof concentration camp, where some Riga ghetto prisoners were later transferred. She is in the deportation records as a name on a list, and then she is not anywhere else. She was 36 years old. Her name appears in one surviving letter written by a Hamburg academic colleague who attempted to secure her a position abroad and failed. The letter describes her as an exceptionally gifted scholar whose work on Arabic manuscripts was of considerable significance. It is a letter of recommendation that arrived too late and went nowhere. The colleague who wrote it survived the war. Hedwig Klein did not. Remember that name. Now let us talk about the man who built the system that killed her and what happened to him. By early 1945, Heinrich Himmler is beginning to understand that Germany is going to lose. The Soviet army is advancing from the east with a momentum that nothing remaining in the Wehrmacht can stop. The Western Allies are across the Rhine. The Reich is contracting toward Berlin. And Himmler, the man who has spent 12 years building the most powerful internal security apparatus in history, is spending his final months on something remarkable. He is negotiating. He approaches a representative of the World Jewish Congress through intermediaries. He meets with Count Volker Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross. He signals to Western governments that he is willing to negotiate a separate peace. Germany against the West, against Bolshevism, in which he, Himmler, would play a central role as a man of order and stability. He is, with the extraordinary cognitive dissonance that has characterized his entire career, offering himself to the Allies as a partner in the construction of a post-war order. The man who organized the murder of 6 million Jews is reaching out to Jewish organizations as a potential negotiating partner. He seems to believe this is plausible. He seems to believe at some deep level that he is a reasonable man with whom reasonable arrangements can be made. That his years of service at the apex of the most comprehensive state murder apparatus in modern history have not eliminated him as a political actor, but have simply been a phase, a job he did, now over, and he is ready for the next job. The cognitive architecture that allowed him to administer the Holocaust without processing it as horror allows him in these final weeks to contemplate a future for himself that most people would understand to be impossible. Hitler learns of Himmler's negotiations and is enraged. Himmler is expelled from all his offices, stripped of every position he has held, declared a traitor. For 12 years, the most loyal of all the Nazi loyalists is, in the final days of the Reich, cast out for the betrayal of attempting to save his own life. Germany surrenders unconditionally on May 8, 1945. Himmler tries to flee. He shaves his mustache, puts on a patch over one eye, obtains false papers in the name of a dead man, and attempts to blend into the streams of German soldiers and displaced persons moving through the chaos of post-war Germany. He is captured on May 21, 1945, at a British checkpoint in Bremervorde. The soldiers who capture him do not initially know who he is. He tells them eventually. He is taken to a British military installation at Lüneburg for interrogation. On May 23, 1945, during a medical examination, Himmler bites down on a cyanide capsule he has concealed in his mouth. He dies within minutes. He will never stand in the dock at Nuremberg. He will never be cross-examined about the Wannsee Protocol or the Poznan speech or the inspection at Auschwitz. He will never be required to explain, in the formal context of a court of law, the decisions he made, the orders he gave, the system he built. His death by his own hand at age 44 is, in a sense, the final act of the control he exercised throughout his life. He chooses when and how the accounting ends. He is buried in an unmarked grave in Lüneburg Heath. The location is kept secret to prevent the grave from becoming a shrine. The trials at Nuremberg, which begin in November 1945, are an attempt to do something that has never been done before in history, to hold individuals criminally accountable through an international legal process for crimes committed by a state against its own citizens and against citizens of other states. The Nuremberg trials establish the category of crimes against humanity. They establish the principle that following orders does not provide a defense against criminal responsibility for atrocities. They establish the precedent that national sovereignty does not protect a government from international accountability for mass murder. These are genuinely important legal and moral achievements. They create the framework within which the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Criminal Court will later be built. They represent a genuine attempt by the international community to learn something from what happened and to build structures that might prevent it from happening again. But the Nuremberg trials also have limits that the survivors understand, with a clarity that the legal proceedings cannot fully address. The trials account for 24 defendants, the senior leadership of the Nazi state. They cannot account for the thousands of SS guards who staff the camps, the tens of thousands of ordinary Germans who participated in the deportation apparatus, the hundreds of thousands who knew and looked away. Many of these people returned to ordinary life in post-war Germany and West Germany with minimal consequences. Some of them rebuilt careers in law, in business, in government. The Federal Republic of Germany was built in part by people who had staffed the Third Reich. This is not a condemnation of post-war Germany as a society. West Germany's eventual reckoning with its Nazi past, the ongoing trials of concentration camp personnel, the memorialization programs, the education curricula, the formal acknowledgement of state responsibility and the payment of reparations, represents one of the most serious national confrontations with historical atrocity in modern history. It is imperfect, incomplete, and in many respects still ongoing. But it is real in ways that many other nations' reckonings with mass violence are not. East Germany, under Soviet influence, took a different path. The Nazis were fascists. Fascism was a product of capitalism. The German Democratic Republic was socialist, and therefore not the successor state to fascism in any morally relevant sense, and the whole subject could be managed primarily as an anti-capitalist object lesson rather than a genuine reckoning. This was a convenient arrangement for the many former Nazis who found new roles in the East German state apparatus. The Federal Republic of Germany formally acknowledged its responsibility for the Holocaust and agreed to pay reparations to Israel and to individual survivors, beginning with the Luxembourg Agreement of 1952. The reparations program has continued in various forms to the present day. It represents a genuine, if always incomplete, attempt at material acknowledgement. But material acknowledgement does not restore the dead. It does not restore Hedwig Klein's career or her translations or the life she would have lived had the world not produced Heinrich Himmler. Himmler's name is attached in the historical literature to a specific number: 6 million. This is the number of Jewish people murdered in the Holocaust, the genocide that was the central project of the SS apparatus Himmler built and commanded. 6 million people, 2/3 of all European Jews. An entire civilization's worth of people, scholars, musicians, doctors, farmers, children, grandparents, infants, teachers, the ordinary and the extraordinary, the integrated and the observant, the secular and the devout, all of them processed through the machinery of the final solution and destroyed. The 6 million figure, important as it is, does not include the other victims of the Nazi state, the approximately 3 million Soviet prisoners of war who were systematically murdered, the Polish civilians, approximately 2 million of them, killed in the occupation of Poland, the Roma and Sinti, perhaps 500,000 dead, the disabled people killed in the Action T4 euthanasia program, the homosexual men imprisoned and killed, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the political dissidents, the others who fell within the system's expanding definition of who did not belong. The total number of people killed by the machinery that Himmler built, including the SS's role in the broader Nazi system, approaches 11 million by the most careful estimates. Some put it higher. What does it mean to be the architect of 11 million deaths? Himmler never answered this question because he never allowed himself to face it. His final months, with their desperate negotiations and their disguises and their flight, are the behavior of a man who is trying to escape consequences, not a man who is reckoning with them. The Poznan speech, in which he congratulates his generals for their strength in performing their terrible duty, is the closest he comes to acknowledging what the system is and what it means. And he frames it as a tribute, as a statement of shared pride, as evidence of their superior moral quality. He died, by all available evidence, believing that the world had misjudged him. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, introduced the phrase that has defined discussions of this history for 60 years, the banality of evil. Arendt's argument, which has been disputed and refined and partially misunderstood in the decades since, is that Eichmann and people like him were not monsters in the traditional sense, not driven by extreme sadism, not exceptional in their hatred, not psychologically deranged. They were bureaucrats. They did their jobs. They followed procedures. They participated in the Holocaust not through demonic passion, but through a kind of thoughtlessness, an inability or unwillingness to think through the meaning of what they were doing. Himmler complicates Arendt's thesis. He's not thoughtless. He thinks about what he is doing extensively. He has a developed ideological framework that provides meaning and justification for the violence. He is not banal in Arendt's sense, but the system he builds runs, as we have seen, precisely through the banality that Arendt describes. The clerks who process the deportation notices are banal. The train dispatchers are banal. The guards who follow the camp regulations are, in Arendt's sense, banal. Himmler designs a system that can be operated by banal people, that converts the thoughtlessness of role compliance into the engine of mass murder. He is the non-banal architect of a machinery that runs on banality. This combination, the ideologically driven designer and the administratively compliant executor, is perhaps the most dangerous possible structure for organized violence. It requires only one Himmler. It can then recruit millions of ordinary people to do the work. The memorial at the former concentration camp at Dachau, the first camp Himmler opened, bears an inscription: Niemals wieder. Never again. It is a statement of intention. It is a statement of what the survivors and the witnesses and the nations that eventually confronted the horror of the Nazi system chose, collectively, to commit to. Whether the commitment holds is a question that each generation answers through its own choices, its own vigilance, its own willingness to look clearly at what organized dehumanization produces before it reaches the point where the trains are running and the gas chambers are built. The notice arrives on a Tuesday. Hedwig Klein packs her suitcase. She is gone. She was here. Her name was Hedwig Klein, and she was a scholar of Arabic languages, and she lived in Hamburg, and she was 36 years old. And the world she was born into should have let her grow old. Remember her name. The question of how a society remembers atrocity is never simply a question about the past. It is always, simultaneously, a question about what the society is willing to acknowledge about itself, what it is willing to carry forward, what it is willing to change. The Federal Republic of Germany's engagement with the Nazi past represents one of the most sustained and serious national reckonings with historical guilt in modern history, and it is also, inevitably, incomplete. The Nuremberg trials principle that following orders does not excuse criminal responsibility is legally significant but practically limited. Of the tens of thousands of men who served in the SS, the Einsatzgruppen, the concentration camp system, who guarded, administered, transported, and killed, only a small fraction were ever prosecuted. The subsequent Nuremberg trials, conducted by American military tribunals between 1946 and 1949, brought cases against medical professionals, industrialists, lawyers, and military and SS officers, expanding the accountability beyond the top Nazi leadership. The verdicts established important legal precedents. They also left the vast majority of perpetrators unprosecuted. West Germany began its own war crimes, prosecutions in the late 1950s and 1960s. prompted partly by the international attention surrounding the Eichmann trial, and partly by the efforts of individual prosecutors and investigators who refused to let the subject close. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965, which brought 22 former Auschwitz personnel before a German court, were a landmark in domestic accountability. The first time that ordinary perpetrators, not senior leadership, were put on trial in Germany, and the first time that detailed testimony about the day-to-day reality of the camp was presented in a German court in public. The trials continued slowly and imperfectly for decades. Former SS guard Oskar Groening, who came to public attention partly through television interviews in which he described his work at Auschwitz in terms that suggested something between pride and shame, was tried and convicted in 2015 at the age of 93 on charges of being an accessory to the murder of 300,000 people. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He died in 2018 before completing the sentence. Reinhold Hanning, another former Auschwitz guard, was convicted in 2016 at 94 of being an accessory to 170,000 murders. These late trials are significant not primarily as accountability measures. The defendants are in their 90s. The sentences cannot be served in any meaningful way, but as symbolic statements. They say there is no statute of limitations on this. They say the law does not forget. They say even 70 years later, even when the defendant is ancient and the evidence requires reconstruction from archival documents rather than living testimony, the society will take the act of formal accountability seriously. The survivor community has always understood something about memory that institutional processes sometimes forget. The preservation of individual human stories is not merely a sentimental impulse. It is a moral and historical necessity. The Nazis murdered 6 million people. The number itself tends to produce a kind of numbing abstraction, the cognitive inability to process a quantity too large to visualize. The response to this numbing that the survivor community and the memorial institutions have developed is the insistence on the individual. This person, this name, this specific life that was lived and was taken. The Yad Vashem Memorial in Jerusalem has spent decades collecting the names of Holocaust victims through a project called the Hall of Names. The project has identified approximately 4.5 million names out of the 6 million murdered. For each name, the attempt is to record not just the fact of death, but some evidence of the life, a photograph, a document, a testimony from a surviving relative or community member. The project is unfinished. It will never be fully finished. There are categories of the dead who left no surviving traces. Communities entirely destroyed, families entirely killed, people whose only remaining record is a deportation list entry. Hedwig Klein is one of these. Her name appears in Hamburg's deportation records. She appears in the Yad Vashem database as a victim. The entry contains the information available: name, birth year, birthplace, last known address, date and destination of deportation. The entry does not contain a photograph. It does not contain a description of her work, her interests, the specific quality of her scholarly mind. It contains the minimum information sufficient to say, this person existed, this person was murdered. The world that murdered her should know her name. The German word Stolperstein means stumbling stone. Beginning in 1992, artist Gunter Demnig has been placing small brass plaques in the sidewalks of German cities at the former homes of Holocaust victims and others persecuted by the Nazis. Each stone is engraved with a victim's name, birth year, deportation date, and fate. Murdered in Auschwitz, died in Theresienstadt, escaped. The stones are set flush with the pavement so that pedestrians do not trip over them, but may, if they look down, find themselves reading a name. Stolpersteine are the smallest memorials in the world, and perhaps the most powerful. They do not ask you to visit a museum or stand before a monument. They ask you to look down while walking through your own city, your own street, and see the name of the person who lived where you are standing, and be briefly brought into contact with the fact that this specific street, this specific building, this specific door was part of the world that ended for someone who deserved to live in it. There are now more than 95,000 Stolpersteine in Europe. Most of them are in Germany. Some are in cities across the former occupied territories. Each one is the size of a cobblestone set in the same pavement that the perpetrators, the bystanders, and the victims walked on. They make the abstraction specific. They bring the history into the present at the level of the body, at the scale of a single step. Heinrich Himmler has no Stolperstein. He has a grave in an unmarked location on Lüneburg Heath, kept secret precisely to prevent commemoration. His legacy is present in the absence he created. In the 95,000 stones, in the 4.5 million names in the Hall of Names, in the millions of records in archives across Europe that document the lives that were taken and the process by which they were taken. The banality of evil that Hannah Arendt identified in Eichmann is a description of one mechanism through which the Holocaust operated. But it is not a description of the whole. The whole requires also the non-banal architect, the man who understood what the system was doing, who celebrated its achievements in private speeches, who toured its facilities and suggested improvements, who burned the records at the end because he understood exactly what the records contained. Himmler was not banal. He was ideological, organized, patient, and deliberate. He built the machine that ran on the banality of others, the combination, the fanatical architect, and the compliant administrator, is what makes the structure possible and what makes it so difficult to prevent. You need only one Himmler. You need thousands of Eichmanns, and the Eichmanns are everywhere, in every society, in every institution, waiting for a system that will organize their compliance into something they do not have to fully understand. This is what the history of Himmler teaches. Not that monsters are rare, but that systems are common, and that the difference between a system that produces ordinary administration and a system that produces genocide is the difference between the values embedded in the system, the accountability structures around the system, the willingness of the people inside the system to look clearly at what the system is producing. The Stolpersteine in the sidewalks of Hamburg include, in the Grindelviertel neighborhood where many of the city's Jewish residents lived, stones for people who were deported in the October 1941 transport. The transport that carried Hedwig Klein east. Their names are in the pavement. Pedestrians walk over them daily. Some people bend to look. Some people do not. The looking is a choice. It has always been a choice. Hedwig Klein did not have a choice about whether to board the train at Moorweide. She did not have a choice about what happened after. The people who walk past her name in the pavement have a choice about whether to see it. So do we all.